Hello party people, and welcome back to Office Hours, the webcast where I take your SQL Server and Azure SQL DB questions and I answer them sometimes in unusual places. In the last episode, I was right down there in the Jokasarlan Glacial Lagoon, and I talked about how when the tide is coming in, it piles all those little glacier pieces up there near the mouth of the glacier. Then, as the tide starts to go out, those little iceberg pieces start to come out, and I said they come down the river. Well, let's take a look at where that is, where those things are going to. I'll turn the camera over here towards the left, and that is the mouth of the river and the ocean. And you can see across the river there where the little pieces of icebergs have been piled up. So you can see this is where people will come out and they'll play with the little iceberg pieces. So I'm going to take your SQL Server questions. I'm going to pivot it back over here towards the mouth of the glacier because I think it'll be kind of neat for you to see when any of the pieces of the glacier come swimming by. Let's lock down the camera again, and then I'll get out my handy dandy little recorder. You can also see sometimes seals coming through here because the seals feast on the fish that have been trapped inside the lagoon, and then they come streaming out at high tide as well. So let's see, the top voted question is from Ozan, who asks, "Hi Brent, can you recommend a book or resources to learn more about the internals of SQL Server in depth, like the SQL OS, block allocations, write and read logic and memory and on disk?" He says, "so that I can figure out whether block allocation still matters on SSD." So here's the thing. I used to be really curious about those internals pieces too, and I went through the Microsoft Certified Master Program, I don't know, like 15 years ago maybe. And what I realized is that I don't use any of that stuff. It was fun to learn in terms of, oh my goodness, I didn't even realize that my Zoom was set in that closely. It was fun to learn in the sense that I really had a good time doing it, but did it help me? Not really at all in my career. I mean, I can think of maybe like 3 or 4 instances through my entire career where that kind of deep internals knowledge really paid off. So as a result, there just hasn't been much published about it or much new training classes put out because it's not really all that useful, and people have figured out that employers don't want to pay for that kind of training. So if you want a book, your best bet is really to look back at any like SQL Server 2000 or 2005 book, and that'll give you the basics of what you need to know. It hasn't really changed much. There are parts that have changed internally, like around column store indexes or Hekaton, but since such a few relative portion of people use those, it really hasn't made profitable sense to record training on those or write books about those. Books were always a bad investment to begin with anyway as an author. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of good news for you there on that one. Next up, let's see here. This one's a long one. JustWondering says, oh, let me get this. Whenever I turn the phone off, whenever I know it's going to be a long question, I turn the phone off, and then I throw it in my pocket, and then at that point it loses connection, so then I got to reestablish it again. JustWondering says, "I've got a vendor application that selects all the columns of a 2 terabyte table. The plan says it's doing a clustered index seek. The table has a non-sequential," this is just going on and on and on. "Where do I start to improve performance since I can't tune it?" Well, so when you say you need to improve performance on it, the first thing that I always want to ask is, what are the top most resource intensive queries on the server? I can't tell you how many times someone has come to me and said, here's the query I need to tune. But then when we go look at the top most resource intensive queries on the server, it's not even on the list. If this is on the list of the most resource intensive queries on the server and it's doing a clustered index seek, and the number of rows that it's reading is equal to the number of rows that it outputs, because you can do a clustered index seek to the beginning of the table and then read the whole entire thing. But assuming that you're only reading one row and then bailing, You don't need to tune it. You're done. Move on to the next query. Because getting one row out of a database, if you need all of the columns, like you're saying that the application needs to, then a clustered index seek, dive bomb into just one row, read that one row out, again, assuming that number of reads and number of rows read and number of rows output is the same. That's as efficient as it gets. The way that you would tune that from the vendor app perspective is cache the data on the front end. I've seen so many cases where people will read data over and over again, not realizing that they should be caching it in the application tier. Next up, let's see here, Balaji asks, is it possible to implement SQL Server failover clustering using Windows Storage Replication in AWS? So you can, but not with Windows Storage Replication. You actually want to use something that provides shared disks at a higher level, like AWS has NetApp storage that you can provision, and then the storage looks like it's available to every VM. They also have shared disks for failover clustering, but I can't remember what the product name is. It's under check under EBS volumes, and there's a kind of volume that you can present to multiple servers simultaneously. But Windows Storage Replication is not the way you want to go. Next up, Faysal asks, do you agree with Chat GPT's ranking of the 10 worst database management systems? And number 1 on the list is Lotus Approach. I've never heard of it, so I don't know. Number 2 is FoxPro. I don't think anyone's still actively using FoxPro in the year 2023. So in the top couple of databases, I don't even think are in use. I think Chat GPT is probably making stuff up there, or as we like to say, hallucinating. I don't think that those are really the worst. It's possible, but it wouldn't be on my worst list. Next up, Henry Jones Jr. asks, what's more popular, Office Hours Twitch streaming or Office Hours YouTube? YouTube by far. Twitch only works for people who can see the thing happening live, whereas YouTube, thousands of people view that over time. The Twitch streams usually only like 50 to 100 people max sit in on those live, just because it's usually so much more convenient for people to watch the recordings later. Next up, Begrudgingly-Learning-MySQL asks, I hate even asking this here, then don't, but you're one of the best authorities in the database space in my opinion. Flattery will get you everywhere. Do you have any recommended courses that can help someone transitioning from SQL Server to MySQL? Nope, I have absolutely no clue. I use MySQL on the blog, but I don't have to write any queries for it, so you've totally got me there. Next up, SQL Stormlight asks, what approach do you recommend to trouble? Hold on a second here, it's not showing his question. I got a little thing that tracks which questions were asked at which times so that we can show it on YouTube and the transcripts and chop it up for TikTok. SQL Stormlight asks, what approach do you recommend to troubleshoot this error when you have thousands of databases and no idea which query is causing this issue? The error is the query processor ran out of internal resources and could not produce a query plan. This alert has been raised hundreds of times over the last week. I honestly wouldn't do anything about it. I would wait for the application owner to come in and complain about it, because generally at some point the application owner people will say, hey, I'm having problems or errors that are popping up, but otherwise I wouldn't even bother. If you really wanted to, you could trace with extended events to see when optimization failed and track which databases are involved or which applications. I don't even know the extended event off the top of my head. Next up, GermanDBA asks, hi Brent, what are some things to consider when weighing transactional replication versus ETL tools for keeping a copy of various columns up to date on a secondary server? For me, that one's a slam dunk. It's really easy to hire people who know an ETL tool. It's really hard to hire people who know transactional replication well. If you got to troubleshoot something and it's going to be in place at your company forever, I would much rather go with the tool that's actively developed, that's easier to hire people, that you may use for other purposes, whereas with transactional replication, you're going to have to pay a lot of money to find somebody with experience in it, or else you're going to be stuck doing the troubleshooting the whole time. Next up, Mr. SqlSeeks asks, I've been tasked to determine how our back-end processes perform with 2x and 3x data volume. Do you have any suggestions as to the most efficient way to basically copy-paste from one instance to another for the purposes of doubling the data volume? No. I'll tell you the single most frequent problem that I run into with people who are trying to amplify their load tests is they don't amplify the number of users. So for example, I ran into one performance issue where somebody had load tested their server and they kept running into blocking problems. And when we went into the load test, they only had one customer, but they had 10,000 shopping carts open for this customer. They were running into blocking problems as they tried to update this person's account. Well, in the real world, one customer doesn't have 10,000 shopping carts open at the same time. 10,000 different customers have shopping carts open at the same time. So it's going to be up to you to amplify the different parts of the load. There is no easy copy-paste for that, unfortunately. That's why I really prefer doing load testing from the front end. Have your front-end developers amplify the number of sessions that are using, the number of things that they're trying to do. And that way, it's much easier for them to generate random activity and to amplify it. And when you do load testing, then you're load testing the entire stack. Instead of having the web people come up with a load test, the API people come up with a load test, the database people, the network people, just do the load testing from the front end and bam, you're done. Also, bam, it's not your problem. Next up, YY says, for a typical transactional application, what is your recommendation on number of file groups? 1, just stick everything in primary. How many files per file group? Generally 1, don't overthink it. And then what table types in each file group? You are overthinking the bejesus out of it for a transactional application. The times when I would consider multiple files is when you expect the database, or it already is at, 1 terabyte of size, and you're hitting storage throughput limitations. Then there are tricks that you can do to break up the files across multiple storage adapters, but it is hard work and it is dependent on the exact kind of hardware and VM types that you're using. So until you come to that bridge, don't bother building in infrastructure for it, because whatever you build in, you're going to be wrong. Your application is going to change in between now and then. When you hit the point where page IO latch is your primary bottleneck, even then, I don't usually recommend breaking the file up into file groups, because it's easier just to throw memory at the problem and call it a day. You know, of course, memory access, it doesn't really matter where the files live. It's going to be insanely blazing fast. If you do get to the point where you have to solve that problem, typically it's on a VM where you're fighting for storage throughput with other VMs at the same time, then you want to work with your VM admins to see the number of host bus adapters that are present in the host, how many connections they have to the storage, and so forth. For example, if they have 4 connections to the storage, you can set up 4 different volumes and put on 1 file in each volume. But then you also have to make sure that the traffic for each of those is going across different host bus adapter paths. Because otherwise, if they end up all on the same path, you're right back where you started. Next up, Red U says, what are the top issues your clients run into? Oh, hold on a second here, it didn't show it again. Maybe it's a flaky internet connection out on the edge of a glacier in Iceland, who knows? Let's see here. Red U says, what are the top issues your clients run into when lifting and shifting SQL Server to Azure SQL VMs? Oh, that one's easy. They used to be able to hand tune the VM configuration. They would say, I want just 4 CPU cores and 128 gigs of RAM, because of course SQL Server being licensed by the CPU core, you want as few cores as you can possibly get, and then as much memory as you can possibly get to cover up query issues. But unfortunately, you just can't do that in Azure SQL VM. You have to choose between predetermined VM type sizes, and then you get into this awkward situation where if you want more memory, you gotta buy more licensing. That becomes pretty ugly. Next up, PrayEveryMorningToSQLGod asks, with a database that's a table of files, aka images, and the images are around 80% of its size, the database is about 1.6 terabytes, do you recommend moving it to FILESTREAM or just leave it alone and pray to the SQL gods? My goals is that I'm trying to improve backup performance and the performance on getting the images. Nope, if you want files to be fast, if you want the backups to be fast, the access to them be fast, you put files in a specialized technology. It's pretty new, but you might have heard of it, called a file system. A file system. You put your files in a file system, just like you put your data in a database. Interesting how that cutting-edge technology works. Lost in Space asks, how can I determine when to use optimize for ad hoc workloads? Oh, we'll do that as a great last question to finish up on. When do I use optimize for ad hoc workloads? When my memory is under pressure from the plan cache and I can't fix the queries by parameterizing them. If the application's sending in a bunch of unparameterized queries and I'm worried about the memory that they consume, that's when I would turn on optimize for ad hoc, because it won't cache the full entire execution plan every time. You know how many times I've done that in the last 10 years? None. Because when you're having that problem of unparameterized queries pouring in, it's not really about the memory. It's about high CPU usage due to frequently compiling the plans, and optimize for ad hoc doesn't fix that because you still got to compile the plans. Anytime that you're considering using optimize for ad hoc, the tool you probably want instead is forced parameterization. And in my Mastering Server Tuning class, I teach you when it makes sense to turn that on and the drawbacks that you have to look for once you decide to turn that switch on. Well, all right, there's an episode of Office Hours there out in front of the Glacial Lagoon. Oh, wow, there are all kinds of icebergs moving in through here now, aren't there? Oh, hot dog, and they're moving kind of quick. Let's go take a look at those. We'll move the camera around a little just so that you can see a little better angle of those. So they're flying right out there, aren't they? That's neat. They're just racing out to the finish line. It's really neat to see how all of a sudden when the tide hits just a certain way, it knocks out this big, huge log jam of ice cubes, and then they all go settling out there out towards Diamond Beach. Diamond Beach is this really pretty black sand, volcanic sand that is just, you know, completely dark. It's totally magical when the ice cubes are up against it. So that's probably where I'm going to go do next, is go drive around or across the other side of this peninsula. I say peninsula, it's literally, the bridge is right there. I can see it, and you saw it when we were driving out there. And then go play around with the ice cubes. Next episode of Office Hours, I'm not sure where I'm going to film it from. I kind of am playing this trip fast and loose. I wanted to get here originally. This is my primary goal in getting on this trip, the biggest thing I wanted to go see. Because I love the way that it looks so different across different tides and times. Then I'll probably be here for another couple of hours looking at as the tides shift and the icebergs move around. And then I think I might go down to Skaftafell, was the campground that I stayed at last night. There are a couple of big waterfalls out there. I might go hiking over there. And then make my way over towards Vik. Vik has another beautiful black sand beach down there and a couple of really nice rock formations. can't recommend Iceland enough. Absolutely beautiful. Just everyone should get out here. It really is another world. So I will see you on the next episode of Office Hours. Adios, y'all.